said I'll never part with you.
Oh, I get it.
You part your hair.
Part your hair. I get it.
Now there might be some problems here with my notes because they got messed up a little bit. But we left off really to the start of the American Revolution. But we didn't really look at what were the advantages and disadvantages when the wars first started. Okay? We did say that if you looked at the advantages and disadvantages, who should win? Well, Great Britain should have won in a landslide. Why? Okay, let's look at their advantages and disadvantages. So just make a column on one side for Britain and one column on the other side for the colony. Okay? So, who has an advantage the colonies have? Yes.
They knew the land.
They were fighting on their own land, they knew the land. What other advantages did the colonies have? They knew the land. This is an advantage for the colonies. They knew the land. Let's go all the advantages first. So, one, the colonies knew the land. What else another advantage?
The French were helping them.
Well, they weren't at the start. They eventually got in, but Gracie.
They picked up other strategies? Like, Canadians?
I suppose you might count that as an advantage, using guerrilla warfare. But they didn't use that all the time. It was kind of there at the beginning. Then they went back to their training, and their training says you do what? You face each other and you shoot at each other. So most of the battles were like that. Well, let's look. They were fighting a defensive war. That's always an advantage. Because, what? Because you know the land. That's part of fighting a defensive war. And all you have to do is what?
Defend.
Defend. Basically, the colonies just needed to stay in the war long enough to what? If you're fighting a defensive war, you just need to stay in the war long enough till what?
Reinforcement.
Kind of lead out their troops, I would say.
So the other side gives up. The other side has to decide that it is not what? Worth it. And that's pretty much what happened in the American Revolution. It wasn't like the U.S. defeated the whole British Army. We're this powerful nation. No. It was the fact that they stuck in long enough. One, they stuck in long enough that they got some help from the French. Okay? They stuck in long enough that Britain decided, hey, it's not worth it. And the other thing that they had an advantage, because they were fighting a defensive war, you have shorter supply lines. Where was Britain's supply lines?
Across the ocean.
Across the ocean. Okay? They also had some good leaders, like Washington. In fact, some of their good leaders actually had fought for Great Britain during what war? The French and Indian War. George Washington was one of their major generals of the French and Indian War for the British. In fact, the British asked him to fight for them against the colonists, but he chose to fight with the colonists. And the other advantage they have is that they were fighting for the cause, a cause of freedom. Basically, they were fighting for their lives, because basically, if you take up arms against your country, what's that called?
Trade.
Well, if it's within your country, yes. It's called a civil war. If it's within your country, this is at the colonies. So what the colonists took up arms against Great Britain, that means they are actually committing what?
Treason.
Treason. So all these colonial leaders would, if they lost, basically what was going to happen? What's the penalty for treason? Ewan? Death. So they're fighting for their lives, really. Now the British, they had all these other advantages. They had a huge, powerful army. They had a strong navy. Their government was strong. They had more money. They had a bigger population. They had more supplies. All these things should show that what?
They should have won.
They should have won. The colonists were any match for the power and the wealth and the training of the English army and the English government. But basically, England underestimated the resolve of the colonists. What's resolve mean? Your resolve means I'm going to stick with this until the very end. We're not going to give up. So basically, the disadvantages are everything opposite of their advantages. So while the colonies had a defensive war, the British had to fight an offensive war, which means you don't know the land, which means your supply lines are long. And the other problem is you got to take the land and you have to keep it if you're fighting an offensive war. So that means if I capture this area of the colonies, I got to leave some troops what? Here to keep control of this area of the colonies before I go fight somewhere else. And then the opposite here. All these advantages of the British are disadvantages. So the colonies had a weak army, poorly trained, had very few supplies. Why did they have few supplies? Because most of the factories for making guns and stuff were where?
England.
In England. They had no navy. It's kind of got cut off. They didn't have a navy. That was the good thing about bringing the French in, because the French had a what?
Awesome.
Navy. Their population was smaller. They had littler money. They had very few factories. So all these advantages. So on paper, if you were going to decide, if you didn't know all the history about our American Revolution and you looked at the paper and you saw all this, you would say, who's going to win?
England.
England. But again, this is kind of an intangible. An intangible means you can't really measure it. This cause of freedom. This cause of fighting or staying in it till the end. Most of the British soldiers, why were they fighting?
Because they were told to.
They're getting a paycheck. They're not fighting necessarily for the good of England, okay? And then you saw this big handout that had all the battles. So you had the handout I gave you, and then there's this handout on your notes too. And which battles did I say you had to remember?
And conquered.
Lexington and Concord, which started the war. What year?
17.
Greta?